Sometimes it feels like the world is just shifting so fast. It's almost impossible to keep up, right? You've got geopolitics over here, digital money over there. It's a constant flow of information. But staying genuinely informed, actually cutting through all that noise, that's not just important, it's doable. And that's really what we're trying to do here in this deep dive. We've gone through, well, a whole stack of sources, articles, research, our own notes focusing on these big global risks and digital changes happening right now. Our mission is simple: pull out the really key bits of knowledge, the essential insights. Think of it as your shortcut to being properly clued in. We've got some surprising facts and takeaways you probably won't get just from the headlines. So we're going to try and untangle quite a bit today. We'll look at those geopolitical tensions, the future of defense alliances, maybe. Then we'll jump into digital currencies, some massive global investments that are making waves, and also the social side, global health, big tech's impact. It sounds like a lot, I know, but we'll make it make sense. Okay, let's start with the geopolitical stuff. Those shakeups and the new security picture. There's definitely growing talk, louder calls really, for Europe to beef up its own defense. With all the instability and unpredictable threats out there, it really makes you ask, can Europe, or maybe should Europe, actually try to go it alone on defense?
Well, that's the core question, isn't it? And what's fascinating is that even with these strong calls for, let's say, self-sufficiency, the conversation keeps circling back to existing alliances. Most experts seem to argue that ditching that transatlantic cooperation completely for full autonomy, it could actually leave Europe quite exposed, strategically
Sure.
speaking. The general feeling is that NATO isn't just relevant, it's still critical. Real security, long-term security, they argue, still depends heavily on sharing the burden, especially with allies like the U.S.
Right. And speaking of the U.S. and burden sharing, this next detail is really interesting. We're hearing this directly from the incoming NATO head, Mark Rutte. He's saying Donald Trump has privately signaled he's okay with NATO, but, and this is the big but, only if European countries seriously ramp up their defense spending for continued U.S. protection. Now, we've kind of heard this tune from Trump before, but hearing it via Rutte, what does that actually signal now?
That's a really sharp question. Because you're right, the sentiment isn't brand new. But the source, the incoming Secretary General relaying this ahead of a potential second Trump term, gives it, well, a much harder edge. It sort of reframes NATO, doesn't it? From maybe an assumed unconditional alliance to something potentially more transactional. This could really force European nations into some tough spots.
Yeah.
Like choosing between massively hiking defense budgets, maybe cutting social spending, or facing a potentially less committed U.S. It goes beyond just burden sharing. It could genuinely reshape defense thinking across Europe, maybe even push those discussions about a truly independent European defense capability forward faster than just relying on the old structures.
And defense isn't the only vulnerability, right? Europe's security is also tied up with its energy. We know they've weathered energy shocks before, but that gas supply network, it still seems pretty fragile.
Yeah, that fragility is definitely a persistent concern. And it really does raise that crucial question about how resilient our critical infrastructure actually is. There are a few key reasons for this ongoing vulnerability. First, there's the simple fact of depending on imports, often from regions like the Middle East and North Africa, which can be politically unstable. Then you add limited long-term storage capacity across the continent. It makes it harder to cushion against supply disruptions. And, unpredictable weather can throw demand forecasts completely off. So what it means is even one disruption somewhere in the system could lead to pretty major supply issues, particularly hitting Eastern and Central Europe hardest. It's a definite weak point.
Okay, let's shift from energy security to something happening in global finance, or maybe global economic influence. China's made this really interesting appointment at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. They've put a famous anti-corruption figure in charge, someone nicknamed the Tiger Fighter, an anti-corruption czar running a major investment bank. That seems like a statement, but what does it really mean? Is it about genuine transparency, or perhaps more about managing perceptions, especially with those ongoing concerns about debt diplomacy?
That's exactly the right question to ask. It's absolutely intended as a strong signal aimed at rebuilding international trust. This figure, the Tiger Fighter, has a reputation for being, well, pretty relentless. But the real proof will be in the pudding, so to speak. Will we see actual changes in how the AIIB lends money, how it oversees projects? It's clearly a strategic move to project an image of reliability and good governance, especially since concerns about debt sustainability and transparency linked to some Chinese initiatives have been growing globally. So yes, a powerful signal, definitely. But everyone will be watching very closely to see if it translates into real, substantive reform, not just, good PR.
All right, let's dive into our next big area, the digital frontier. Finance, regulation, all that good stuff. Let's unpack stablecoins first. These are the digital currency supposedly pegged to real money, right? Often sold as the safe way into crypto. But it sounds like their path isn't exactly smooth sailing.
No, not at all. Despite that safe label, stablecoins, which, claim they hold reserves like dollars or bonds, one-to-one, to back their value, they're facing a ton of scrutiny. The core issues really boil down to what are they actually backed by? How transparent are those reserves? And do the mechanisms designed to keep them stable and liquid actually work under pressure? The big risk, the real danger, is during financial stress. If those reserves aren't truly there, or if they can't be sold quickly enough, the stablecoin could lose its peg, its value could collapse. And that's not just bad for the people holding the coins. It could potentially destabilize financial systems, especially in emerging markets, where sometimes these coins are used almost like a substitute for the local currency. That just magnifies any potential crash.
And it's not just analysts worrying about this. You've got central banks teaming up, putting out reports. Central banks saying stablecoins perform poorly as money. That sounds pretty damning. But couldn't you argue this is just the old guard, established finance trying to squash innovation, especially where these coins might actually be useful for people?
That's a totally fair point, and it definitely captures the tension here. Central banks are inherently conservative, right? Their job is to protect monetary control and financial stability. But their criticisms tend to focus on really fundamental things. Can these things actually hold their value consistently? Is there any transparency about the assets backing them? Are they even efficient for transactions? These are like basic tests for something to function as reliable money. So their worry seems less about stifling innovation for its own sake and more about preventing harm. They want a safe, stable system, particularly for those vulnerable users in emerging economies where a stablecoin failure could be truly catastrophic for everyday people. So, yeah, if you look at the bigger picture, it really highlights this fundamental clash. Can private tech companies really just create their own money without much stricter rules and oversight? That's the core debate.
Okay, so while some digital money faces headwinds, other players are innovating strategically. Let's talk about Revolut, the UK fintech unicorn, valued over $1 billion. They seem to be borrowing from the Tesla playbook for finance. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, it's fascinating to see that kind of cross-industry inspiration, isn't it? Revolut's approach is really focused. It's direct-to-consumer. They don't spend loads on traditional marketing. Instead, they work hard to build this incredibly loyal, almost cult-like following among their users. And they're just rapidly adding everything to their app. Basic banking, sure, but also investing, travel benefits, shopping deals, the works. They're really trying to redefine what a financial super app looks like for today. Kind of like how Tesla aimed to own the whole customer experience in cars. Revolut wants to be the center of your financial life.
And talking about ambitious strategies, let's look at India. Huge investments happening there. Indian billionaire Gautam Adani is pushing ahead with a massive $100 billion investment plan. What's the story here, especially given all the scrutiny he's faced?
Yeah, $100 billion.
Yeah.
It's a colossal bet on India's growth trajectory, no question. And it definitely sends a message. Most of that money is earmarked for green energy, ports, logistics, digital infrastructure, basically, the foundational stuff India needs for its next phase of economic expansion. And what makes it particularly interesting, as you said, is that this commitment comes even while Adani's group is dealing with those serious fraud allegations from U.S. short sellers and the resulting scrutiny. It's a pretty powerful statement from Adani, basically saying that neither global pressure nor financial headwinds are going to derail his big bet on India's economic future.
Okay, let's shift focus now to our final section, global health, social impact, and digital accountability. A really critical issue has surfaced, a major funding shortfall for global vaccination programs. This seems to be linked to recent aid budget cuts from several Western governments. And surprisingly, Bill Gates has spoken out about this, but maybe not in the way people expected.
No, exactly. And this really brings up some important questions about global responsibility, doesn't it? And maybe the future direction of international aid. What's genuinely surprising is Bill Gates' position. He's explicitly said his foundation will not step in as the funder of last resort this time around. Considering the Gates Foundation's massive historical role in funding global health, that's a significant statement. Now you've got health organizations sounding the alarm, warning quite starkly that unless new donors step up and quickly millions of people in poorer nations could lose access to essential vaccines, that could undo years of progress. It really puts the pressure back onto governments and perhaps other large philanthropic players in a very direct way.
And finally, let's touch on Australia. Their online safety regulator is making waves with a pretty bold proposal. They want to include YouTube in a proposed ban on social media use for kids under 16. But wait, YouTube isn't technically social media, is it? So what's behind that push?
Right, technically it's a video sharing platform. But the regulators' concerns are very real and cover a lot of ground. They're worried about harmful content served up by the algorithms, things that can lead young users down dangerous rabbit holes. They're concerned about privacy issues, and just the general impact on kids' mental health from spending so much time on these platforms. So while YouTube might not fit the strict definition of a social network, its design, the addictive nature, the comment sections, the personalized feeds, makes regulators treat it like one when it comes to protecting minors. It shows how regulators are having to adapt their thinking as the lines blur in the digital world. What even is social media anymore?
So there we have it. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from those complex geopolitical maneuvers and the, frankly, sometimes messy evolution of digital money, all the way to really vital issues like funding for global health and how we regulate these huge digital platforms. What really stands out, I think, is how interconnected all this stuff is, even when the topics seem miles apart.
Absolutely. And understanding these connections, these complex global currents, isn't just interesting trivia. It's actually essential for navigating the world we live in now, which is changing so rapidly. Things like continuous learning. Thinking critically, they aren't just buzzwords. They're the tools you need to connect the dots, see the bigger picture, and maybe even get a sense of what might be coming around the corner.
So, thinking about all these shifts we've discussed, alliances becoming more transactional, the digital finance roller coaster, the health funding gaps, what's the most surprising ripple effect you think might emerge from all this in the next decade? How could it touch your world in ways we haven't even thought about yet? Definitely something to ponder. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.